Hello and welcome to Speaking Spirit, where we talk about all things spiritual. Your host, John Moore, is a shamanic practitioner and spiritual teacher. And now, here's John.
Hello, everybody. It's been a little while. I'm a couple days. I usually would be getting this podcast out, and I apologize for that. Although I did do 2 episodes last week, so maybe that makes up for it a little bit. I'm sure you will find it in your heart to forgive me. This I normally record these in the morning, and this today is no exception to that. It is the morning. And I do like my coffee. If anybody knows if there is a deity or spirit or something associated with coffee anywhere in the world, I would love to know that. Get in touch with me. I'm just really curious. I suppose I could do my own research, right? I could Google it myself. But I would love to hear from people if anybody knows. If there's a deity of coffee, I should probably put a statue on my altar or something. But anyway, I'm drinking my coffee. I'm drinking out of a mug that my children gave to me for Christmas this year, and the mug has a picture of Grumpy Dwarf from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And if you're unfamiliar, with that particular Disney movie from the 1930s, Grumpy Dwarf is a guy who's always he's always pouting. He's always unhappy about what's going on. And so there's a picture of Grumpy on my mug, and in a circle around him, it says, "This is my happy face." And that always kind of cracks me up a little bit, partially because of the juxtaposition of this frowning, unhappy character. And, and the phrase, this is my happy face. Obviously, that's kind of humorous. But it leads me into today's topic, actually, quite well. And, that topic is, that I've titled this The Alchemy of Suffering. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about alchemy and suffering. And I want to leave you today, before this is done, with some really, really practical tools you can take out with you to heal the world, really, to heal yourself, to heal the world. And hopefully you'll put it into practice and find that incredibly useful. You do not have to be a guru to change the world. You do not have to be, a spiritually enlightened master. You can change the world no matter who you are. In fact, just by existing in a physical body, you do change the world. You make an impact on the world, and you have a choice about how you can show up in the world and how you can impact the world and all of those things. And you can, because at your core, and this is a core truth I've spoken across numbers of podcasts, at your core is this divine spark, a piece of God, if you will, right? Every living soul has this. It is who you are at your core. It is unchangeable, inseparable, inviolable. It's your connection to source. And so you have divinity within you. I have 100% faith in that statement. This is not, this is not something I made up to feel good or anything like that. I've worked with this principle a lot in my life, in my training with my clients. When I teach practices around the space, and I'm going to talk about one of them today, which is a particularly powerful practice that has borne out some pretty incredible experimental results when it's been put to the test. So I will talk about that. But the topic today is alchemy, and particularly what I'm calling the alchemy of suffering. if you're not a history buff or, ancient history buff, certainly. So, the term alchemy, you might have different thoughts about that. You might picture, a wizard-looking person with a long beard and a lab with crucibles and, glassware, doing experiments and trying to turn lead into gold. And certainly that is a part of alchemy. We have, the practice of chemistry, the science of chemistry today, owes its roots to the early alchemists. In fact, the word alcohol, which is, some of us enjoy more than we should. Some of us enjoy more than others. But is also, alcohol is also a tool for, sanitizing things and that sort of thing. It has the same root as alchemy, and because the process of distillation, and it's interesting that we say the distillation of spirits, right? We talk about, in English anyway, another a synonym for alcoholic beverages is spirits, and that's not a there's some meat there. There's some meat to be explored there. It's a little bit beyond the topic of this podcast, but I'm a little bit of a word nerd, and I like that stuff, and I love history and particularly ancient history. But so the practice of alchemy, came from a time where science and spirituality really were hand in hand, right? So if we look at Isaac Newton, right, who did so much of the work that we rely on today, okay, Isaac Newton, the English scientist who, we'll say discovered the laws of gravity, planetary motion, invented calculus in his spare time. He was actually home avoiding the plague, which is an interesting parallel to what's going on today with the pandemic. He invented calculus. He, we use in physics his principles are taught and used to this day in physics. But Newton dabbled in alchemy. He had an alchemical lab, and he, there are, we have writings. He wrote about it. He did practical experiments, physical experiments, and he, I'm going to condense his viewpoint greatly, so excuse me for that, but I don't, would not have the time in any single podcast to discuss his viewpoint thoroughly, but he viewed the universe as like a giant machine that was like clockwork, right? Like the insides of a clock working, and he saw, God or spirit as the driving mechanism behind that. And the practice of alchemy, the practice of studying physical material and trying to transmute it, had a spiritual component in two ways. One, there was no real separation between spirituality and science. God, if you take the Christian perspective, the Judeo-Christian perspective, God was present in everything and everything we did, and they were trying to discover basically the secrets of God, the secrets of how the universe was created and things were made, and the principles behind material things, right? How did the material world come into existence, and how was it maintained, and how do we have from a single origin, right? From God speaking a word, how did everything come into existence? And if we think about how the Big Bang happening, right? The entire universe being created from an infinitesimally small particle, and then all of a sudden it's everything. It took a little time to become everything we know. We had to have some stars show up and make some elements for us. But it's really similar. If you parse the language of what's being described, I honestly think I would like to return to a time where science and spirit is hand in hand, and that it's not automatically assumed that one thing cancels the other thing out. We can have evolution, right? And we can also have spirit. We can have chemistry and we can have alchemy. Okay. So these alchemists who are physical, what we call practical alchemists, were trying to work out the secrets of nature. And yes, they were trying, in many cases, to transform lead into gold, because that would have been a really cool way to get rich back then, if you could do that. And they were also trying to find this thing called the Philosopher's Stone, which was the magnum opus, the great work, the thing that would give you immortality. And so that was sort of the practical side. Now there is, on a purely spiritual level, and I don't, because a lot of this is a little bit murky in history, because there was a lot, particularly in Western world, there was a lot of repression of ideas, and certainly spiritual ideas that were outside the bounds of sort of what was considered acceptable at that time. We don't 100% know when there's this sort of, and how the sort of split between pure spiritual alchemy and practical alchemy happened. But alchemy started to become about transforming the person, transmuting the person. The lead of suffering and normal life into the gold of enlightenment, for a lack of a better term, right? Becoming spiritually perfected. Purification is a big part of the alchemical process. And alchemy finds its way into many, many different spheres of Western spirituality. Certainly Eastern spirituality has its own forms of alchemy. If you look at Taoism, they have elements the same way that we use the alchemical elements in Western spirituality. So we have, earth, air, fire, and water. You've probably heard that before. It's a little bit different in Taoism, where they have, earth, wood, fire, water, and metal, but it's the same idea. You have these sort of principal elements. And this shows up in everything from hermeticism to ritual magic to, the symbols of the tarot deck, right? The tarot deck, you have the cups, which represent water, and the wands, which represent fire, and the swords, which represent air, and the pentacles or the discs, which represent the element of earth. And the tarot goes back hundreds of years, and obviously alchemy is much, much older than that, these principal materials, but that got filtered through all of these different lenses. So the base practice of alchemy is about transmutation. It's about taking something maybe less desirable and transmuting it into something more desirable, lead into gold. So when I talk about the alchemy of suffering, I talk about transmuting suffering. And I'm going to differentiate a little bit between the idea of pain and the idea of suffering. Because pain is something that is kind of a given. If you have physical existence, we feel all sorts of pains. Sometimes you have physical pain, and you can do all sorts of things to numb your pain, right? If you have a toothache, you can take some medicine or go to the dentist. If you have a headache, you can take some aspirin or whatever, acetaminophen, or however you pronounce it, wherever you're from. I realize that different countries, different English-speaking countries have different ways of pronouncing that. It's fine. So we have ways of numbing our pain, right? Because sometimes we associate pain with suffering. Suffering is about something deeper than that. It's about an emotional resistance to the pain, for lack of a better term. It's about holding the pain in place by resisting it. It's about, to speak a little bit, maybe in an adult manner. So we say, there are people in this world who practice sadomasochism, for example, as a sexual practice, who embrace pain as a source of pleasure, right? And I don't know, but I've spoken to people who kind of live in that world, and it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing that they can take pleasure from physical pain. Some people take pleasure from humiliation. I would say that there is this sort of way we bring pain into our lives and hold it in place, because there is a part of us. There's a part of us actually that enjoys the suffering because we're used to it, or there's some trauma in our life, or we're trying to replay trauma or wounds so that we can heal it. But it's there. It's there so that we can heal those parts of ourselves, right? On a physical level, if I have a toothache, right, I feel pain. I could numb that. I could take some drugs. I could drink a lot. I could do all kinds of stuff and not, be less aware of the pain or be not aware of the pain. But I'm not addressing the toothache. I'm not addressing the issue. What I really need to do is go to the dentist and have my tooth taken care of, right? Instead of just numbing the pain. And so often in this world, that's what we do. We stare at our phones all day. We drink. We do drugs. We escape into spirituality. I've talked about spiritual bypassing before, right? Which is the use of spirituality to not address pain points, to not address wounds, to not do your healing. And I will repeat this till I'm blue in the face, and I'm sorry if this is something that I've said over and over again, and I will continue to do so. I guess I don't actually apologize for it because it's intentional. I do not care if you think you're enlightened, if you are a guru of some kind, if you can levitate, if you can walk through walls or turn invisible. You always need to be working on yourself. You need to do your self-work. There's an important reason for that. It's because you are a conscious projection into the world, right? Your existence on this plane of reality is being projected through, layers of your spirit and layers of your consciousness. And we heal the world when we heal ourselves. Let me repeat that. I'll actually reverse it. I'll say when we heal ourselves, we heal the world. And that's absolutely true. And there's some great research out there. I was reading, I'm very interested in trying to be a good parent. I have children, and I will never say that I am perfect ever in my life. I am far from a perfect parent. But I do my best, and I do my best to be conscious about parenting and make good choices about the things that I do and say and how I show up in the world with my children. And there is fantastic research showing that parents who do their work, whether that's going to therapy or doing your own shadow work or what have you, it is incredibly healthy for your children, right? Because just the way you show up in the world affects everything. It's so impactful upon your children. But I would extend that out and say it's not just your children. It's the people you interact with daily. We're imagine that we're just walking around. The pandemic is actually sort of a good metaphor for this, right? We're walking around infecting everybody with our energy. And the thing is, we can do it. We don't have to be in close physical contact to do that. So I hope, for example, that when you listen to this podcast, that my energy comes through and that it is loving and nurturing and informative. I hope. I work on that, right? And so if I can sort of infect you with that positive energy, that I think makes the world a better place for everybody. And there are a few practices I'm going to talk about, like specific meditational practices that you can do and learn more about. I don't have time to actually teach them all in this podcast, but I'm going to tell you about them. And certainly you can find out more. I do want to, there is an interesting book I want to recommend. I'm going to recommend a couple of books today. I read a whole lot, but I very rarely recommend books because I think it can be very personal. I mean, I would recommend a book sort of one-on-one. If a client or a student came to me and they were, struggling with something and I knew a book that had some really good information for them, I would not hesitate. But sort of blanket recommendations, because I know everybody listening to this, I have listeners from, I think the last time I checked, 21 different countries. Gosh, I'm grateful for that. That makes me so happy that I get to talk to people from all over the world through this forum. And so, you're all living in different cultures, and you're men and you're women and maybe transgender or non-binary, and you all have different lives and different cultures and different languages, although I'm assuming you at least speak English as a second language, because you're listening to me and I'm only communicating in English at this point. You don't want me to try to speak anything else. Probably easier to understand me in English. I have a smattering of French, and I grew up in an area where there were, some French-speaking people, but it's full of slang and my accent's really weird, I'm told. So I'll stick to English for now. But I'll recommend a couple of books today. And the first one, primarily because I was talking about the way we hold on to pain sometimes and derive pleasure from it, and sort of along the lines of people who engage in BDSM in their sex life. There is a book called Existential Kink by a woman named Carolyn Elliott that I like a whole lot. I've listened to it on audio and I've read the book. And she does couch things in sexual terms. If you're uncomfortable with that, maybe that isn't the book for you. But what she's really talking about is this stuff, how we sometimes attract painful experiences into our lives, either to relive some trauma or, there is some part of us that's taking pleasure from bringing these painful experiences into our lives, and sort of what to do with that. I mean, there's practical advice. I don't think the observation alone, it's definitely interesting, but without, okay, I understand that. What do I do with it now? That's of limited use. So she has lots of practical exercises, and I am in a study program with her. At the moment, I'm in a year-long study program with her, and it's absolutely fascinating, absolutely fantastic program. I recommend her as a teacher, and I do recommend her book. And again, it's called Existential Kink. You can find it wherever books are sold. I'm sure you can find it Amazon or bookstores near you, or order it through a local bookseller is a great way to get a hold of books and support local business. So that's one book that I'll recommend, and I'll talk about the other one in a few moments. But I do want to talk about transforming suffering, and there are a few ways to do this, and one is transforming our personal suffering, right? Transforming how we show up in the world is by transforming our personal stuff. And really, when you get underneath it all, we're all connected. That's the principle there. Everything is connected to everything. And so if you think of yourself as like a node in a giant three-dimensional net connected to every other node, and every other node is a person or a being of some sort that has the capability to suffer. When you change yourself, it sends ripples along this net in every direction. And so, working on transforming suffering helps to transform the suffering of those close to you and those distant from you, because it sends ripples out. You can't do anything without having, sort of the butterfly effect of it spreading throughout the world. So, if you're familiar at all with Buddhism, the Buddha talked about the Four Noble Truths, right? And the Four Noble Truths are all about suffering, that there is suffering, that there's a reason for the suffering, that there's a way out of the suffering. And really, the teaching, not to simplify all forms of Buddhism into sort of a single idea, but just the idea about suffering is that there are sort of two main causes of suffering. And those causes are attachment and aversion, right? We want to cling to those things. We attach to those things that bring us pleasure, and we avert or push away those things that we perceive as bringing us pain. And the thing that causes us suffering from attachment and aversion is that nothing lasts forever. So anything, quote unquote, good that we attach to, that we have to, derive pleasure from, is not going to last forever, right? Relationships change and end. Sunsets end. A good meal ends. Our good health might end as we grow older. We all die. Everybody who has ever existed has or will die someday. So there's impermanence, right? And so anything you attach to, anything you say, these conditions are necessary for me to not suffer, is a recipe for suffering, because those conditions will not always exist. Besides your indwelling, unborn, divine spark, there is nothing that's permanent. Everything changes. So that's one lesson. The other lesson is that we avert the things that cause us pain, thinking that if I hold them off, I will not suffer. So, right, I numb myself with alcohol so I don't have to face my emotional turmoil. Or I, push away thoughts that are painful to me. I push away grief, for example. A relationship ends or a loved one dies, and I stuff the grief down in. That, honestly, is just a recipe for prolonging suffering, if not increasing it, multiplying it. And so there's this state of equanimity that the Buddha attained, where, we say no attachments, no aversions, right? Be attached to nothing, avert to nothing. That's hard. Boy, it's hard. If it weren't hard, we would all be enlightened. We would all be Buddha. We would all be the Buddha, right? But this is a major lesson. I think that I am on this earth to learn in this body. And this body does experience pain. This body has experienced, this mind body has experienced suffering. I experience attachments and aversions. I'm not above that. Obviously it would be hard for me to talk about it if I was above that. And I would be the Buddha, right? So I wouldn't necessarily have a podcast. I don't know, would the Buddha have a podcast? What do you think? He did preach, but maybe he would have a podcast if that technology existed back then. I'm not the Buddha. I'm not enlightened. I'm not beyond suffering. I'm not beyond attachments and aversions. I work on it though. I work on those things. It's part of my self-work. It is a tree that has borne much fruit in my life. So, we can work on equanimity. And so the second book I would recommend to you today, the second and final book I will recommend to you today, is a book that is super practical and deals directly with attachments and aversions and releasing emotional energy and that sort of thing. And that book is called The Sedona Method, Sedona, after the city in Arizona in the United States. The author is Hale Dwoskin, Dwoskin. And again, this book's been out for a long time. I first read it, a long time ago, because I didn't have kids when I read it. And I remember that because the book was so profound to me that I was like, I need to go meet the guy who wrote this book. And I flew out to Sedona and did a class in the Sedona Method out there, and then did another class with the author in New York City, and I've done all kinds of online classes. And again, like, this is it's a book that has a series of practices, each one a little deeper, each one a little more profound. And the method was created by a man named Lester Levinson, who passed, I think in the 80s, maybe 80s or early 90s. He passed and passed the torch on to Hale Dwoskin, who runs the organization and teaches and wrote this book, and there's a movie as well called, I believe it's called Letting Go, which is sort of a video teaching of these teachings. And I highly recommend it as a practice. One of the nice things about it is it is spiritual without being spiritual. Like, the practice is all about using the emotions as a tool for release. You do not have to adopt a belief system or give up your belief system or study with a guru or not study with a guru or anything. When I've gone to, the couple trainings I've done, I've sat in the training with people who were all walks of life. I remember meeting a rabbi in there, for example, and people who were hypnotherapists and people who were really into yoga and people who were not considering themselves spiritual at all. So to me, it's a brilliant practice. It's really about the human condition, and it's one form of the alchemy of suffering. It's about transmuting these feelings, going deep into feelings and releasing them, which, when you do that, they just become energy. All emotion is an energy. It have specific frequencies and all of that stuff. So this is between existential kink and the Sedona Method, these are really some tools for personal transformation. And then, so I'll move from sort of personal transformation to some types of spiritual alchemy that I believe are, how I describe it, more global ways that you can act that are sort of outward facing. So Sedona Method and EK are very inward facing practices. And that's fine. And in that respect, and the fact that they're inward facing, we might say that they're reflections of the divine feminine, right? The divine feminine is sort of, or not. I mean, you could look at it I guess you could look at it from the perspective that it's also it's a divine masculine effect, because you're working on the individual. So there's a bit of a balance there. But it is inward. They're inward practices. I do want to talk about a couple of outward spiritual alchemical. That was a hard word to get out. I apologize. Spiritual alchemical practices that are a little bit outward facing. And this isn't to say that you will get no benefit from them, because that is not true. Because as you affect the world, you affect yourself. You are inseparable. You are not, I hate to say this, but even though your ego says you are, you're really not a separate being. You're an aspect. You're an aspect of the divine. You're an avatar of the divine. I know that word avatar has very specific meaning in some religious practices, and so I apologize if I'm using it in a way that's incorrect for your belief system, but I'm just saying that you are a representation of divinity that's inseparable and connected to everything else. You're an aspect. And so there's a couple practices I will talk about. The first one is a Tibetan practice. Oh, and I think I'll end with another Tibetan practice that is very individual as well, but I'll talk about these practices first. So the first Tibetan practice is called Tonglen. And this is a practice that the current Dalai Lama has said is the highest form of Tantra, right? And I'm not particularly an expert in Tantra, and in the West, when you say Tantra, most people think about sex, but that is one tiny part of all there is of Tantra. And so to me, from my viewpoint, as sort of an outsider to, tantric systems, although I studied tantric Buddhism for a while, again, Tantra is about spiritual alchemy. It's about transforming, transmuting, different forms of energy. Like the sexual practices of Tantra are about transforming the energy of desire into the energy of enlightenment. So Tonglen, Tonglen, and there are different ways of practicing Tonglen, and I will let you Google that. You can find lots of instructions out there and sort of different ways to practice. And if it interests you, find a way that works for you. But Tonglen's a meditative practice, and in the meditation, you do along with certain types of breathing, you visualize taking in the suffering of the world. And sometimes you'll focus on a specific aspect, right? So I might focus on, I want to take in the grief of people who have lost a loved one to COVID, right, to the coronavirus. And I will breathe that in. I will imagine taking that from the world and breathing that in. And then I will use the energy of my heart center to transform that into healing light. And when I exhale, I will visualize exhaling the healing light. And it's a profound practice. It's an absolutely profound practice. It heals the world and it heals the energy. And in the process, you heal yourself, because when you're taking in certain types of suffering from the entire world, you are part of the entire world. That includes you. And so Tonglen is become part of my personal practice. It's something that I'm going to try to spend some time with daily, because I have found it to be profound and beautiful. Another practice that comes from Buddhism is, before I get into that, I do want to say, I recognize that breathing in suffering, imagine breathing in suffering, might seem a little shocking for some people who have certain New Age belief systems where, what you focus on is what you attract into your life. And so why would I focus on suffering? Why would I breathe that in? That sort of thing. And I understand that concern. I can tell you that you're not breathing in the suffering and dwelling in it. You're breathing in the suffering to transmute it. And the consensus is from people who have been practicing this art for who knows centuries, is that it is far from harmful. It's actually a really beautiful healing practice. And so that's not something I would be particularly concerned about. If you were doing some sort of practice where you breathed in suffering and that was it, you don't really want to take that on. That's not sort of a great thing to take on. So the next piece also is a form of Buddhist meditation, and again, this is one that exists in different forms, and so I will leave it to you if this interests you. But this is a form of meditation called metta, metta, which is also called loving kindness, compassion meditation. And during this meditation, there are basically recitations that you do. So you imagine, you imagine somebody that you love, and then you do certain recitations. May they be free from suffering. May they be free from physical pain. So it's like a little blessing that you're doing, and you go through, different relationships, people that you have relationships with, and you, picture them, and you do these recitations. And it includes people that you've had difficulty with, people who might not have shown up in loving, supportive ways in your life. And when you take somebody who has hurt you and, maybe been not so nice to you, and you wish for them to be free from suffering, there is this beautiful alchemy that happens inside you. This starts to allow forgiveness to creep in. And forgiveness is a sticky topic. I'm going to do an entire podcast on forgiveness very soon. Sometimes we focus on forgiveness to the detriment of somebody who has been victimized by somebody else or who is suffering. And you need to forgive, you need to forgive, you need to forgive. That's not a good way to approach forgiveness. And again, I'll do an entire podcast on that. But you can begin. Metta can be a way for you to begin to experience some forgiveness, some letting go. And in this way, forgiveness is not about letting somebody off the hook for, causing you harm or causing you pain or hurting you. Forgiveness is a way for you to release some of the suffering that you are holding. And that is a beautiful thing. That is a transformative thing. And I love metta, and I've led metta meditations before. And it's such a sweet practice. So I would encourage you, if this sounds like a nice thing, give it a try. And again, it's a Buddhist practice, but you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice metta. It's pretty much non-denominational. It's not a prayer per se, although they're little prayers, they're recitations, and you're not praying to a deity. So if you are, a devout Muslim, I don't think there would be anything there that would prevent you from doing that, or a devout Christian or what have you. I don't think there's anything in there that would counteract your religious beliefs or your practices or prohibitions against practicing something else. And I think that's true for anything I'm recommending here today. So have at it. Metta is another beautiful practice. So another practice that I want to talk about is sort of, it's taught by a pretty well-known shamanic teacher named Sandra Ingerman. And even though she's a shamanic teacher, she will tell you that this practice is not, it's not shamanism per se. even though that's her thing. And it was taught to me by my shamanic teacher. And it's something I practice, and it's something that I have taught my students and, my people that work with me as clients. And that is a practice called transfiguration. And again, I'm not going to teach it over this podcast because it would take too long. And I'm just sort of wanting to introduce you to some alchemical practices that you can do. Transfiguration is an absolutely beautiful practice that involves really getting in touch with and identifying that divine spark that I talk about so much, and allowing that divine light that comes from you to just shine unhindered. And Sandra Ingerman has done some amazing experiments with transfiguration where they have taken, polluted water from a stream and, placed it in a circle where they were all doing this transfiguration practice, and then sent the water off to the lab, and the contaminants disappear out of the water. So it's become a practice that a lot of people are using to heal the earth, to heal people around them. The thing with transfiguration that's a little bit different than something like metta or some of the other practices that are about sort of transmitting. Transfiguration is not about transmitting. You just project your light out into the world and it goes where it goes. But it does happen to have an interesting effect that is, I think, still undergoing scientific study. My guess, it's going to be very challenging for science to explain how it works. But do we really care? Do we really care? But it's nice. And again, this is where these areas of science and spirit can kind of go hand in hand. Hey, we have this practice. We know it has this effect. We don't know exactly why it has this effect, but we can prove the effect. So keep practicing, right? Placebo effect is a good one, right? Where you can even tell people they're being given a placebo and it has an effect on them. And we don't know exactly why that is. We don't know if it's belief or the energy or what is going on there, but placebos work. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So these are some of the practices I've gone through, Sedona method, existential kink. I've gone through, Tonglen and metta and transfiguration. So there's 5 alchemical practices that I would encourage you to look into, try out, adopt, adopt the ones that are useful to you. Adopt the ones. And how do you know what's useful to you? You'll know because your personal suffering will decrease, and you'll experience change in people around you. Your relationships will change, that sort of thing. This is where you can be a little bit of a scientist, right? Where you can experiment and, form a hypothesis. If I do this practice, I'm going to feel happier. Do you? Do you feel happier? Do you feel more at peace? Peace is sort of there's stuff beyond peace, but peace is sort of a very high level state to be in. Peace is, we speak a lot of peace, but peace is really, where we're at with the Philosopher's Stone. When you get to peace, you have that state of equanimity where you're no attachments, no aversions. That is really spiritual peace, what we're talking about. We think of peace so much as the absence of war or, that sort of thing. And that is true. That is a definition of peace. But when we say peace be with you, or I wish you peace, or peace, love, and happiness, what does that really mean? Well, it means this state of equanimity, this state of being unbothered, right? There's a Japanese deity, Fudomyu, which he's unmovable mind, right? Unmovable mind, unmovable heart. That doesn't mean you don't emote. It doesn't mean you don't feel love. It doesn't mean you don't, you can't be moved to tears by a beautiful sunset. It just means you have this peaceful sense that is abiding and doesn't go away based on the circumstances that you're experiencing in physical life. So with that, I see a crow has just flown in front of my window. As I talk about peace, crows happen a lot when I'm doing this podcast and I'm looking out the window and looking at nature. They're signifiers that usually what I'm talking about has some significance to it, at least to me. So with that discussion of peace, I will personally wish you peace, and I will talk to you next time. I hope that you will contact me with any questions through my website. It's mainshaman, maineshaman.com.
You have been listening to Speaking Spirit with your host, John Moore. For more info or to contact John, go to mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.